For the clutch, you will need several pieces. You will need 2 pieces of stiff interfacing, folded in thirds. You will need a lining piece that is light fabric, and then the outer piece, which is a mid-weight fabric, matching thread, a piece of African fabric, an OWC label, and some decorative pieces. The design is the most important part of the clutch, so make sure that it's lined up properly and that any pattern on the outer fabric matches the lines of your top third decorative pieces. Pin and stitch the pieces onto the top third of the outer fabric and use a matching thread so that it doesn't stand out. If your lines are not straight, you don't want them to be evident. Again, make sure everything is very straight. You should iron all the pieces before you sew them on, and make sure that any trim pieces are taped on the ends so they do not unravel. One of the pieces I showed you at the very beginning was a blue piece that ended up being impossible to sew. It has several biases and it was very stretchy and could not line up correctly. So I decided to replace it with something a little easier to sew. It's important that everything line up beautifully to make the clutch look nice. Always remember to take the pins out as you sew. Keep things lined up. Be sure and cut your threads at the end of each stitch. Now that I have my decorative portion done and I have an opening at the top, enough room for a seam, I can trim the edges to match up with the outer fabric. But in this case, I'm going to leave some of the trim long because it will unravel. I changed my mind there. Keep it taped up. Okay, so now I'm going to fold the interfacing into thirds and I'm going to place it on the back side of the lining fabric. I'll center it carefully. My point is to make sure that it doesn't actually fall within one of the seams. That's the most important part. If it's too large, ask somebody to help you trim it down if you are uncomfortable trimming it yourself. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark 5 1/3 inches down from the top of the lining fabric and mark it with chalk. And then I will draw a line to sew the seam on top of. This seam will hold the interfacing to the lining. Ideally, you should use a matching thread so it disappears. In this case, I'm using a blue so it'll stand out so you can see for instructional purposes. This stitch line is what is going to hold the interfacing to the lining. As you can see, this is the line that will show 1/3 of the clutch. Now I'm going to sew the OWC label onto the lining just below that stitch line, centered, and then I'm going to stitch all 4 sides. Now you can see the stitch line that holds the interfacing to the lining. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put right sides together with the top sections meeting the top sections, and I will pin it. I will, in this case, I'm going to pin and then I will sew just the top portion so that we can check it and see how it looks, and then we'll continue on around. One of the things you need to make sure you do when you stitch all the way around is leave an opening on the bottom side of about 5 inches. You will need that room to be able to turn the clutch right side out. Before I stitch, I'm going to stick the smaller piece of interfacing underneath the top of the larger interfacing. And it may be possible that some of the interfacing will catch in the seams, which is fine, but ideally you don't want much of it to catch in the seams, otherwise it'll be impossible to turn it right side out and to make it look good. So here I have sewn the top seam and I see my seam line is a little irregular. I will flip it over just to make sure everything matches, and I'm not real happy with how it all matches up. You can see the little zigzaggy on the dots in the middle. So I will make a slight change to that seam line. That's a very important seam line. Here I have corrected the seam line so that it goes straight and the fabric looks much better on the other side. Now I will continue sewing around the three other sides. First I will pin it and then sew it. Again, remember to leave the 5-inch gap on the bottom so that you can turn it right side out when you're done. You can see here that the interfacing got into the seams in a couple of places, which is not a problem. Now I'm going to trim the corners, and I'm also going to trim where it's heavy, where the African fabric and the other fabric is attached to the top. It's a little heavy there, and when you turn it inside out, that will be a problem. Now that you have trimmed the corners and the heavy fabric in the seams, take the clutch from the bottom and turn it right side out. You're going to need to spend some time getting all the corners very square. And the way to do that is to use a blunt instrument and push the corners out. You can use an eraser, you can use a tool that's got a blunt end to it. You can use any number of things, but do not use anything sharp because you'll poke right through your clutch. Our next step is to close the seam on the bottom, which means you'll need to fold it in so that it looks like a seam, and you will have to top stitch. You may need to actually trim a little of the interfacing, which I did here, to make room for this seam, because you want it nice and even and flat when you're done. After you have folded it nicely and it fits with the interfacing down low, be sure again that your corners are nice and square before you sew the seam, and it will be a top stitch of 1/4 inch using the matching thread. But first you want to iron it, make it nice and flat, And ideally, you don't want to have the lining fabric sticking up above the outer fabric. It looks better if the outer fabric is over the top. Once you've top stitched the bottom of the clutch, you will now fold the clutch into thirds. And the bottom third will go up to your stitch line. Be sure and pin it nicely and make sure it matches to your stitch line. Then you will top stitch both sides. Go very, very slowly because it's thick fabric and you could break your thread, you could break a needle, and your machine can get jammed easily because it's so thick. So take your time, and you may need to actually spin the wheel with your hand at some points. You can see here I actually got stopped and I had to spin the wheel. Now I am doing the other side. It's best to do a top stitch on the top of the clutch. That's the meaning of a top stitch, so it's visible and the cleanest look is right on top. Once you have finished top stitching both sides, you should give it another good pressing and make sure everything aligns correctly so the flap goes directly over the rest of the clutch and looks nice and even. Give it a good pressing. If it's special material, you may need to put a cloth between the iron and the clutch material, but just give it a really good pressing.